Good evening and welcome to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, the creator of this podcast, and what you are about to hear is a short teaser for the latest bonus episode. As you may or may not know, Dead Sleep is 100% ad-free and listener-supported. That means it really does rely on you, the listener, to succeed. If you would like to ensure the success of this podcast and enjoy a subscriber-only bonus episode each month, please feel free to subscribe via Spotify, Patreon, and Apple Podcasts. Just a few dollars a month really does make a difference in covering the essential production costs in making this podcast. Thank you for supporting my work, and I hope my work supports you. You can enjoy a free month on Apple Podcasts and a free 7-day trial on Patreon. Thank you. And now, on to the teaser of the latest bonus episode. Welcome back to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. This is the July 2026 bonus episode. It's Nancy, of course. Thank you so much for supporting this podcast. And as we settle in, allow me to share a bit about tonight's episode. For this episode, we are going to travel back in time. Back to 1931, the height of the Great Depression. Money was tight for just about everyone. This was even true for the strappiest of bootstrappers, people who were born and raised to survive. People like Laura Ingalls Wilder, who'd endured a childhood growing up on the American frontier in the late 1800s, only to find herself in her 60s and virtually broke. That's right. Half pint barely had a penny to her name. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Just a few years earlier, Laura and her husband Almanzo, they lived modestly but comfortably on their farm in rural Missouri. That is, until their daughter Rose suggested they withdraw their life savings and invest in the stock market, which they did, pooling together a lifetime of scrimping and saving for their final years. It was terrible timing. It was 1929, and within months, the stock market crashed, and like millions of Americans, Laura, Almanzo, they lost everything. Everything except their memories. And now, she was mining those memories for their last opportunity at some viable income. It was, she knew, a long shot. But Laura Ingalls Wilder hoped that someone, a publisher, would be interested in her life story. A book about what it was like to grow up in a little house on the prairie. By her 40s, Laura was already a published writer, and she wrote for magazines, including a column about farming. But she dreamed of publishing a book. The title of the book she conceived of was Pioneer Girl. But she couldn't seem to get any traction on her manuscript. Once again, it seemed like a case of bad timing. It was the Depression. And publishers didn't think people wanted to read about how hard life was. They wanted to escape. So Laura thought of ways to make her stories seem happier, more upbeat, harsh realities softened into inspiring, teachable moments. That in the end, no matter how hard life gets, everything will work out just fine. Thanks to the love of your family. But her daughter Rose, she had another idea. Laura's daughter, Rose, was herself a prominent writer and editor, and she was her mother's closest collaborator. Rose was something of a true crime buff before there was a term for such a thing. And she was clear what the story of the pioneer girl was missing was murder. Seriously, what this book needed was a long saga about an elusive band of serial killers who terrorized the Midwest in the late 1800s. And what was most chilling is that much like the Ingalls, they too were a family. At least that's what they said. They called themselves the Bender family. Ma, Pa, and 2 grown children, all of whom were believed to be behind the murders of at least 8 people. Tell that story, Rose told her mother, and you'll sell this manuscript. Laura wasn't sure. She imagined her book would be more aimed towards young people, but maybe, Laura thought, her daughter was right. So Laura, with the help of her daughter, folded in a juicy story of her father crossing paths with at least one member of the Bloody Bender family and narrowly escaping alive. Now, as you likely know, the first book by Laura Ingalls Wilder, called The Little House in the Big Woods, it did not include anything about serial killers. Nor did the subsequent 8 books or the TV series from the 1970s it was based on, nor are there any lurking killers in the Netflix series that was just released this summer. So Laura ended up not including any details about the Bloody Benders in her books. And that was probably for the best. But many others have written about the family. From the 1870s up until the early 20th century, their sensational crimes were covered by just about every newspaper across the country. And one of the reasons why people found the Bender family so fascinating was because they were never caught. So who the Benders really were and where they ended up, it remains a mystery to this day. And for well over a century, there have been plenty of wild theories and half-truths. But a recent book, published in 2022, titled Hell's Half Acre, The Untold Story of the Benders, a Serial Killer Family on the American Frontier, by a writer named Susan Janusis. It offers one of the most intricate and likely most accurate version of these very strange events. And I will link to that book along with some other key sources, including material from the Library of Congress and a revealing memoir, a first-person account of what the investigation was like, written by the wife of one of the victims. Now, it is unlikely that Laura Ingalls or any members of her family ever met the Benders. And Laura, she was born in 1867. And when this all started, she was just 3 years old. But Laura and her family could claim a connection to the Bender family. A connection that started all the way back in the 1870s. The Ingalls, they only lived in Kansas for a year. And at the time, their swift departure from that area, it was seen as a failure. Little did they know, they were the lucky ones. Just a half a mile away were their neighbors, fellow homesteaders who would find themselves the hapless victims of 4 scheming killers, better known as the Bloody Benders. It was late December 1872, a bitterly cold winter morning, as a young father named George Loncourt bitterly regretted what he'd done. He'd waited too long to leave. The week before, the weather was glorious, the sun warm, the air crisp. His horses could have clopped along with ease. Then, with a surge of icy wind, everything changed. But George, he'd come to expect it. In the 3 years he lived on the prairie, he learned that's just how things went. Life could change in a moment. The proof was tucked right next to him. On his wagon, in a cozy bundle, was his precious baby girl, Marianne. Marianne wore the little hat and tiny mittens her mother had knit for her just before she was born. They were supposed to be the first of many mittens, scarves, and sweaters to keep her little girl warm. Only now, these items were more like keepsakes, tokens of remembrance of a mother the little girl would never know. Just 7 days after giving birth to a happy, healthy baby girl, George's wife, Mary Jane, suddenly died from postnatal complications. This was one of the most common tragedies on the prairie. These homesteads were so isolated, so far away from any doctor, there was no way to get help for a mother or a baby in time. After his wife died, George did his best to take care of this baby by himself. He was a blacksmith, which actually gave him an opportunity to make an income that a lot of other homesteaders didn't have, including the Ingalls. But God, he was tired, and he was sad, and he was lonely. And he could only hope these feelings weren't contagious. He didn't want to infect his joyous and jubilant baby girl with his febrile melancholy. Then one day, as he sat in the cabin with Marianne clutched to his chest, he heard somewhere in the distance the most unfamiliar of sounds, the sound of laughter, of playing, of children. And he followed the sound to the nearby home of his new neighbor, a highly respected doctor named William York. Dr. York and his wife were around the same age, maybe a little older, in their early 30s, and they had 3 children. The Yorks welcomed George and doted on the little girl, and Mrs. York agreed to help out with the child while George tended to his blacksmith business. And initially, it proved an ideal arrangement. Then in the fall of 1872, George received an important letter. The letter was from his late wife's parents, who lived in Iowa. And perhaps, given the circumstances, would George consider leaving Kansas, moving to Iowa, and letting them help raise little Marianne? By then, the girl was nearly 2 years old, and she was at that age where she needed constant oversight, which he couldn't do. Nor could Mrs. York, who was by then expecting her 4th child sometime in the spring. And George didn't want Marianne to add to the kind woman's burden. George felt torn about leaving the homestead. Like many men making their way west during that time, he fought in the Civil War. Then this move out to Kansas under the Homestead Act of 1862 was his chance at a fresh start. He could honestly say he fared better than most on that prairie. Many didn't make it a year before leaving, be it in a covered wagon or a pine box. But this was what was best for little Mary Ann. Anything could go wrong out there, especially for a child. The Yorks, they were sad to see them leave, but they supported his decision. George and William York had become close friends, and the doctor agreed to sell George his own wagon and a team of horses at a steep discount. So his only regret that freezing cold December morning was that he'd waited a week too long. This was going to be a cold and uncomfortable ride. But off they went, father and child, forging ahead, starting over once again, never realizing that day marks the beginning of the end. With a decent team, a horse-drawn wagon back then moved at a steady pace of roughly 3, maybe 5 miles per hour. And with the load George carried on that wagon, the ride from Independence, Kansas, to his in-laws' place in Iowa, it would take at least 3 weeks, which meant George was expected to arrive in Iowa sometime in late January or early February. So when January, even February came and went, without a word from George, Dr. York and his wife didn't think much of it. And it might have stayed that way. The fate of George Longcore and his daughter Mary Ann, a minor musing. Then in early March, Dr. William York heard some strange and unsettling news. He heard through the grapevine that earlier in the winter, someone had found a wagon and some horses along a trail just outside of a town called Cherryvale. The men who recovered the horses and wagon had placed a notice in the local newspapers, hoping to track down the owner, but they never heard from anyone. And now it was March, and the men wanted to keep the horses and the wagon, but they wanted to ask around one last time, just in case somebody knew something. When William York heard the description of the team and the wagon, they sounded just like the ones he'd sold George. But he would need to see the team and the wagon to be sure. He was already planning a trip to visit his father about 100 miles away in Fort Scott, Kansas. He told his wife he felt compelled to find out for certain, and he was going to make an extra stop or two to see, were these the horses and the wagon that he'd sold George? And if so, well, then he'd have to find out what happened to George and little Mary Ann. He told his wife the whole trip there and back would take 10 to 14 days. He expected to be home on March 18th. When he failed to return on March 18th, now it was his wife, whose name was Mary, it was her turn to worry. It wasn't like her husband to not turn up without a word. He too served in the Civil War, working as an assistant surgeon on the battlefield. There he encountered the kind of injuries no medical school could ever prepare him for. And that was Will tending to the injuries of other men. Near the end of the war, Will was himself captured by a rival faction and tortured. And part of their torture was being forced to march hundreds of miles from Missouri to Louisiana wearing only torn rags with no food, water, or shelter. Once at the POW camp, he was strung up and forced to hang by his thumbs. He'd managed to survive, but the jagged scars from the rope on his thumbs, they were still there. A reminder of how fragile life was and how cruel men could be. Mary York was herself a nurse during the war, and the two shared a bond over their desire to help others. William, however, he threw himself into helping people, sometimes to the detriment of his own well-being. She prayed he hadn't helped someone, then gotten sick himself. Mary went to the local post office each day expecting a letter. Some kind of news. By March 21st, when he hadn't returned, she knew something was wrong. By the end of the month, she was frantic, and she reached out to William's family to see if they could help. There she learned her husband had made his destination. He had visited his father in Independence, Kansas. Then after that, he headed back home. Only on the way back, he took a few extra days to check in on that team of horses, that wagon, to confirm if it was indeed the rig he'd sold to his friend. And he told Mary and his father that if he could confirm that wagon belonged to George, he would need to find out any information he could on the whereabouts of his friend George and his little girl Marianne. And now he too was missing. William's father was in poor health, so he couldn't ride up and down the prairie searching for his son. So he asked William's brothers, 31-year-old Alexander and 21-year-old Ed, to help. Alexander, the politician, hired a private investigator. And as soon as they could, they now hit the trail in search of William York, hoping for the best, but expecting the worst. William York's family was prominent enough that news of his disappearance soon made headlines. But so far, that coverage hadn't made the search for William any easier. But these stories did connect some crucial dots. It turned out William, and perhaps George, were just the latest missing persons in what appeared to be a series of mysterious disappearances along that road. And it seemed these men were all travelers, men visiting from somewhere else, never to be seen or heard from again. The locals had their suspicions about someone who might be involved. But when pressed, they didn't offer many specifics. They had to be careful. She might be listening. And if she heard something bad that they said, sorry, but they were as good as dead.